All right.
Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, and I am joined once again by my ministry partner, Caleb J. Mullins, who I always love to have on the show. But this time we're going to be talking about something a little bit different because Caleb and I have just written a book together, and we're in the process of getting it all ready for you. But the book is historical fiction, and so I decided to have Caleb, well, actually, Caleb wanted to come on. So I can't take full credit for the idea, but um, we're
Yeah,
gonna
bossing
talk to.
around.
That's right. That's right. We're going to talk about the historical setting in which our book takes place, and I think we'll also get into. I mean, it's Caleb and I, so we can't totally stay away from discussing the paranormal. So we'll discuss some of that stuff too. But I'm super excited for this. Caleb has done so much research to prepare for writing this book, and it's been a joy writing with him. So I'm really excited to pick his brain. Before we get into it, though, I do just want to throw out a disclaimer that sometimes history is really messy, and the people, even the people who you might be rooting for, so to speak, in a particular historical event, don't always come out of that event looking like the good guys. So, if you're not used to studying history, especially if you're not used to studying kind of Western history during the time of the Crusades, we're going to be talking about some pretty disturbing stuff. So, if you have small children, maybe don't listen to this around them. If you have, children who are a little bit older, this might be a good catalyst for some difficult discussions, but if they're not ready for that, I totally understand if you want to wait to listen to this until you can listen to it on your own with just an adult audience. Kind of viewer discretion is advised. So Caleb, now we know that a bunch of teens are going to be like, "Oh, I gotta watch."
Yeah, now sold our book to age 13 to 16, or I'm gonna read this because mom and dad don't want me to read it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
We're gonna have a
Oh,
bunch of like I honestly hope we get a bunch of like metalheads reading our book, and then maybe they'll
yeah.
graduate from us to Death to the World or something.
Yeah. I mean, well played, sir. That's all I have to say. Yeah. So yeah, for those of you who had no idea this was going on, this is something that Kevin and I conceived of probably 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of birthed out of all of our love for writing, for history, for fiction, and for as well as theology, and as well as horror and fantasy. um to say our book is historic fiction, yes, it is. But to say that's all it is really, it's really not all it is. We're obviously big horror fans. We've done several podcasts on horror, and,
Yes.
and we're also have a deep love for mythology and folklore and things like that. So this is historic fiction, but with a heavy dose of horror and mythology thrown in. And in my background, just to kind of, I don't know if anybody even knew this, but my background, I have a master's degree in English, with a focus on medieval literature, which is partly why we chose this time period in history. The medieval period is actually one of my favorite times in history. It's one of the most misunderstood periods in time. It's often caricatured. It's often criticized unfairly, for a lot of things that occurred and things that happened. But nonetheless, it is a darker time in history in many respects, especially in Western Europe.
Right.
And it's really the perfect setting for a horror story in more ways than one, just because of the cultural and historic dynamics that were happening at the time. And I've always loved period horror pieces. Some of my favorite horror films actually happen in period time periods, not my own. Probably next in the medieval period, my favorite type of horror settings are actually Western horrors, believe it
Oh
or
yeah.
not.
Mm-hmm.
I love Western horrors. I don't know what it is, but
Definitely.
yeah, and one of my favorite horror movies is Bone Tomahawk with Russell,
Nice.
with Kurt Russell. Have you seen that Bone
Yes.
Tomahawk?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Freaking awesome.
or freaking cannibal cavemen in the Western horror time period. Oh, it's great. I just love it. I love Kurt Russell as a cowboy, so I was like, this is good.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this was birthed out of that, and I always wanted to write a book, and Kevin's already ahead of me on that. I've never had one book published yet, and I'm like, man, I got a master's degree and never published anything in English. Like, I need to do this. I need to do it quick, and because I was not a fan of my thesis at all. It was, now that I look back, I'm kind of ashamed of it, but it got me my degree, so I'm like, okay. But
Right.
so this is in a way sort of
We've all
my
been there. We've
yeah,
all been.
exactly.
As Stephen DeYoung would say, that's the thing about college is you have to have theses, which means you have to keep writing these, keep revisiting these topics.
Exactly. Things have to be written. So even if there's left to say about it,
Right.
Yeah. So choosing the medieval period for the two of us, we had a large swath of history to pick from, and that was difficult to do because I mean, well, when did the Middle Ages start? I mean, arguably, I mean, I don't think most historians would do this, but if we're talking about the way people live, I mean, the kind of the Dark Ages up until probably the 15th century could be considered, the Middle Ages, medieval type period. People were
Mhm.
using swords and armor and fighting with that type of, military might, and people were living very much that same way until
Right.
the modern period. And for some reason, because of, we wanted to do something that had to do with the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople and the
Mhm.
Fourth Crusade, because that's near and dear to us who are Orthodox Christians. But it was like, okay, well, that's all well and fine, but then what's going on in Western Europe at this time?
Right.
And not really to our surprise, but what was paralleling that time, or not long after that time, was something called the Cathar Crusade in France. And as soon as we began researching and reading about what occurred during the Cathar Crusade, we were like, this is the perfect horror setting. It really is.
It is.
Yeah.
Especially if you know about the Cathars.
Yeah. Why don't you kind of jump off and tell us who the Cathars are, Kevin?
Oh, sure. Well, so again, this is kind of it. This is a story where there's a lot of bad guys and not a ton of good guys.
Yeah.
So the Cathars are really they're kind of a revival of Manichaeanism in a lot of ways. And so they show up in the late medieval period. And they are a very cultic sect with some bizarre practices. They actually would commit ritual abortions. They,
Ritual suicide.
um, yeah, ritual suicides. Um, they had I don't necessarily think that they participated in cannibalism. There are some Catholic sources that say that they did cannibalism, and I don't think it's just propaganda. I think that the
Mm,
Catholics actually thought they were doing cannibalism, but I think that's a result of the fact that they were doing ritual abortions and human sacrifice, that it was just sort of assumed that there had to be cannibalism in that.
mm.
Um I don't necessarily I don't really know. Their own sources don't tell us whether they went as far as cannibalism, but it's not a stretch. Like, if you're
Yeah.
sacrificing humans, you might be eating them too. like
Yeah.
the jump isn't too far from that point. So,
Especially if you understand sacrifice in terms of a
right,
communal deal with your deity or deities, as the case
exactly.
may be. Yeah.
Which that's how ancient people understood sacrifice. I'm not sure if the Cathars had that deep of an understanding of it though, so that's the only thing.
Yeah. And
Um,
France seems to be this place in medieval history. We're talking 13th century France, where it's like heresies that have been supposedly long dead just all of a sudden crop up again, right?
yeah.
Because before that, with the reign of Charlemagne, you had a revival of Arianism in France, which
Hmm.
led to fixing the heresy with another heresy called the Filioque, uh, which,
Right.
yeah, what better way to fix a heresy than to
The
use another?
heresy.
right. Which we see that pattern a lot in the early church, with
Oh yeah.
Apollinarianism and things like that. But you get you get this revival of essentially Manichaeism, and this is nothing new. I mean, this is Gnosticism, right? It's going
Right.
back to one of the earliest ancient religions there is on the planet. And, we've done podcasts on Gnosticism before.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of the baseline of Gnosticism is it was likely, from what we can tell, birthed out of the ancient mystery cults from Babylon, Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, ancient Greece. And this is it share that they can be different as the day is long, but they share a kind of a baseline belief that they build upon, and that is that the physical world is bad, material world is inherently evil, or made, or at least made to be hostile to human
Right.
beings. The gods who rule the world are complete jerks, which in the
On
pagan
that
sense, I
part, they're
agree.
yeah.
Right.
On that
And
part, they're probably right.
yes, and so the idea is that in order to transcend this trap that you're in, you have to basically find a way to escape the material plane. Usually, this is through some sort of secret knowledge, secret rituals, the gnosis, as they said,
Mm-hmm.
and being enlightened in that. But because of
Which, by
having
the
this,
way, this is what some people try to say. Like, they try to defend Gnosticism by being like, oh, this is kind of like Buddhism or whatever. The
right,
biggest difference between Gnosticism and Buddhism is exactly what Caleb just said. It's the Buddhism does not teach this idea, or at least Caleb can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in my studies of Buddhism, for the most part, most Buddhist sects don't teach that you transcend by escape, which is a
mhm,
good thing because that is the teaching that leads to all of that terrible stuff that I was talking about before. The reason why Gnostics get into really bizarre, really grotesque, disturbing practices is because not only do they deny the physical like Buddhists and Hindus do, but they believe that you sort of transcend the physical by escape, not by, like with Buddhism, it's just sort of like meditation or whatever, which is, benign. But with them, it's like you have to transcend by, you know, like getting out of it. And so they don't necessarily have the same kind of perspective where Buddhists are like, well, the physical world is all just kind of an illusion. Gnostics are like, no,
right,
the physical world is actually bad and I'm better off dead. And if that's your perspective, you will be led to some really bad practices. There was actually a Gnostic sect in Russia. They were contemporaries with Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky wrote about them. Um, but Dostoevsky didn't write about what they did. He just writes kind of some tracts within his writings. He writes some things about them, and I had no idea who these people were. I looked them up. It turns out these people were Gnostics who would actually cut off their own genitalia as an
yeah,
effort to like escape the world. They had this bizarre
mhm.
interpretation of Genesis where the forbidden
And
fruit
that's
is
men and women,
genitalia.
not just the
Yeah.
men. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Men
yeah,
and women. So really, so point I'm making is they're not like Buddhists. They have really disturbing the
mhm,
it's a really bad philosophy, and that's why in the early church they were so dedicated. So many books from the early church are about refuting Gnosticism, and a big part of why is because these are not good people. They have very
yeah,
disturbing beliefs and very disturbing practices that flow out of them. So sorry, go
yeah.
on.
And no, you hit a very important point there, and that is that in the West, people say kind of have this notion that heresy is just holding to a wrong belief, right? And while that's somewhat true, that's not completely 100% true, right? It's, I mean, it's for us as Orthodox Christians, the practice is far more important than
Mm-hmm.
dotting every I and crossing every T when it comes to theology, right? For us, we really emphasize that at the end of all time, when the final judgment occurs, Christ is going to ask, "When you saw me naked, did you clothe me?" Whenever,
Exactly.
right? He's going to ask about your works, right?
Exactly.
And so the I'm not saying that belief in Christ is not important. It certainly is. And but
No, it is, but like in the
right.
early church, there were people who were heretics, as far as like their beliefs were heretics, but they didn't leave the church.
Yeah,
What
like
defined someone as a heretic was that they left the church. If you stayed in the
right.
church and submitted to the church, then in the early church, they didn't believe you were going to hell. Like you might
Yeah.
have Arian beliefs and be like, I guess the difference is whether it's a question or whether it's a statement. So if I'm confused and I'm like,
Hmm.
was there a time where the sun was
And was
not?
not. Yeah.
But I'm in the Orthodox Church. I'm staying in the church. I'm committed to the church and I'm willing to go where the church leads, then I'm not a heretic. I'm just a person who has questions.
You're wrestling. Yeah.
Whereas if you're like Arius and you're saying there was a time when the sun was not, and you can't tell me
Hmm.
otherwise, that's heresy because now you don't have the humility to listen to the church. And I mean, just as a personal example, when I first joined the Orthodox Church, I was really wrestling still with predestination. And there was a lot of texts of scripture that I was like, this really looks to me like predestination, to be honest. And my priest still allowed me to join. And some people would probably balk at that, but he recognized that I had humility and that I wasn't saying, I believe predestination, I believe the Calvinist doctrine of predestination is true. I was saying, I'm really wrestling with this. And
Hmm.
it looks like this to me, but I trust that the church is correct and I'm
Right.
willing to work through it. And obviously I have worked through it, but during that time, you'll notice that when I was first coming from 3 years ago, you'll notice that Freed Indeed didn't have any videos about predestination. I didn't have any discussions about predestination, none of that, because I didn't want to say anything that was going to contradict orthodoxy, and I wasn't sure yet that I could do a presentation on that without
Yeah.
making an error. So you see this time period where I didn't discuss a lot of topics related to that because I was trying to have humility. And so I guess the point is Caleb's point about what heresy is in the East is very spot on. Yes, you can have false beliefs that are heresy, but the issue is what you do with it. If you're
Yeah.
teaching others to be heretics, then that's problematic. If you're just asking questions, then God is not going to punish you for asking questions. Like God gave you a brain, use it.
Yeah, and it's that's what it comes down to, is that the true heretic is the one whose beliefs translate into evil practices. And a lot of people in history, like we'll just take the Arians for example, try to really depict the Arians as being some sort of like persecuted minority nice guys. One of the guys who does this is Isaac Newton. Yes, that Isaac Newton was an Arian. And that's really not the case at all. Arius, was corrected several times by his hierarchs. Arius wasn't even a bishop; he was a priest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And rather than listen to those who had in charge of shepherding his soul, he went out and taught this aberrant doctrine to other people, and he
Wrote
gained
songs.
like a quarter of the church or more ended up following him, and his church persisted for ages, like I mean centuries after his death.
Yeah, there was
And
still an Arian church in Constantinople when
while
uh
Constantine was
well
emperor, yes,
Constantine was
his
emperor.
sister was an Arian. I mean,
Yeah.
he was baptized by an Arian,
Mm-hmm.
and so this so and people say, well, what's the harm in believing something contrary to what the church says? Well, here's what Arius did: is his followers, who some of them were bishops, would take their priests who refused to accept the Arian heresy and held to the Orthodox Trinitarian doctrine. He had them beaten, he had them
Mm-hmm.
deposed, he had them, some of these Arian bishops had them like tortured and things like
Yeah.
that. And it's horrible. I mean, this, if you read the account of Saint Athanasius and what his bishop put him through, it's really the Orthodox people who got the really bad treatment
Exactly.
from it, not the
Mm-hmm.
Arians. but yeah, and then of course I okay, I'll go here. Islam, for
Yep.
example, is seen
Mm-hmm.
by the Orthodox Church as a Christian heresy. And at first it was this small little derelict group of, what they described as Christian heretics in Saudi Arabia, but then it exploded, becoming this military force that was backed by the Arabian, tribal leaders and chieftains that,
Mm-hmm.
eventually led to the Crusades and things like that, and what we see today. So heresy is very, and just look at the Christian cults today that kind of came out of Protestantism, Mormonism, for example, who mistreats women horribly. So yeah,
Yeah.
heresy leads to very horrible practices. It's
Oh
not
yeah.
just, oh, you got the wrong belief, you're going to hell. I mean, if that's the case, Saint Justin Martyr's going to hell. I mean,
Right.
he
He
was
had
a
some wrong
killing
beliefs.
ass. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the fact is, he never broke from the church, and he said that there were many pious Christians that disagreed with Chiliasm. So he
Mm-hmm.
had the humility to admit that, yeah, most people don't agree with me on this.
Right.
Um, but
Exactly.
nonetheless, what we have in the Cathars, is that, yeah, resurgence of Gnostic belief. And at first, I think it was sort of viewed as like a cult, something that was going to be really small, easily contained, and it wasn't going to grow very big. But then it was soon discovered that it had grown more than what people realized, because for one, the Cathars never called themselves Cathars. That was
Mm-hmm.
what their enemies called them, and they called themselves good Christians, and it made a real big splash. We're really not sure
So
so
they were
much who.
basically Protestants. No, I'm just kidding.
Ah, we'll avoid that question for now. But it was really appealing to the peasantry, because
Right.
it really shunned the conventions of the Roman Catholic Church, and this is well after the Great Schism. So, and it shunned the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church and the hierarchical structure, and it seemed to be something more accessible to the peasantry, because anybody could become a Cathar perfect. A perfect
Mm-hmm.
is like their version of a priest, whether they were, a peasant or whatever. And it was a lot easier to do than going to seminary and becoming a monk
Yeah.
or whatever like that. Um, and some of their practices, for example, because they shunned the physical world as most Gnostics did, is they would do things like, for example, they had such rigorous fasting, it became almost to the point of starving oneself. They wouldn't eat meat. They wouldn't eat any animal products, so they were vegans, right, at best. And
And remember,
they
these are vegans in the medieval world. These are vegans
right,
in a time before you could buy a veggie burger. So this is
r-
like
yeah. So what do you eat?
full real veganism that is
Yeah,
these people are not really sustaining their bodies
right.
very well at all.
Right, and so the perfecti, the priests would fast so much that they said that they would try to get to the point where they couldn't eat it, wouldn't eat at all. Of course, a lot of them died because of that, and they also told anybody who joined them that they had to refrain from any sexual activity whatsoever, even between a man and a woman, between a husband and wife. And their and if if a woman was pregnant, they encouraged her to get an abortion. And the whole reason for this is because they had the belief that the world was created by the demiurge, very Gnostic belief, which is a lesser, angry, evil god, right? And one of the ways, and human beings were actually angelic, small, I guess, lesser divine beings, right? That had been trapped in the physical world by the demiurge. And why he did that, I'm not sure that they actually talk about that, but I have a suspicion is because the demiurge fears he would be challenged or overthrown or something like that.
Yeah, they have
And
a weird thing where it's like they believe that there was a pleroma and the pleroma.
right,
So it's like so you have the original God, which in Christian versions of this it's the Trinity. In non-Christian versions of this, there's other things,
yeah,
but there's this original deity, and then from him, it's a little confusing why this happens. I'm not totally sure what this is about, But it seems like they basically say because he's God, he just sort of, it's just in his nature to do this. It sort of splits into first
Hmm.
three and then 12 and then or first
Like
three, then
hundreds
eight,
of
then
thousands
12, then
of
yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's like, and
very
then
similar
that's
to
where,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So that's
very similar to Hinduism. Yeah,
yeah, very similar to Hinduism. It's like you have
right,
this splitting off happening, and
right.
then this, and then these have this, what they call the fall is actually them literally falling into the physical world and becoming, so yeah, it is a little unclear why the demiurge traps these entities from the play Roma or whatever they are
Hmm.
into the physical world, but it seems like either, like Caleb said, he's afraid of being challenged, or there's like a bizarre thing where they're like falling into it in a way because of the passions,
Right.
um which they have this whole like mythology around how the passions, anyway, it's super weird. If you want to, look into this and in a safe way, Saint Irenaeus has a complete refutation of
Against heresies. Yeah.
against heresies, is like the book one of Against Heresies. He just totally explains Gnosticism way
Some real
better.
light reading there,
Yeah,
Not a
exactly.
period in sight.
Right.
Enormous
Just
sentences. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and so you have this, and this is very similar, in some ways to Mormonism. The whole
yeah.
idea that humans are actually divine beings, at our essence, And so because of this, they said that the demiurge would use things like food and sex to make life pleasurable so that you would never want to escape this trap he has put you in. So he makes this beautiful prison for you, right? And so the one thing they encouraged most was what was called the consumentum, which was a ritual sacrament of suicide that the Cathars produced. And basically they said that the most enlightened people would get to the point where they were comfortable with euthanizing themselves, and the perfecti would oversee that. And so this goes on, and again, the Catholic Church thinks it's just mainly a couple of rogue monks or rogue priests and some peasants, but they soon find out that a lot of the nobility in France have adopted Catharism. And I mean, very powerful people, not just like, and that's when the Pope realizes this is getting out of hand. Like this is becoming, a danger to the Catholic Church in France.
Mm-hmm.
So from 1209 to 1229, the Catholic Church declares a crusade against the Cathars. Okay, it's literally called the Cathar Crusade or the Albigensian Crusade. And what's going on at the same time is France is also participating in the Fifth Crusade across the sea against the Muslims. So France is a very busy nation at this point, right? They've got internal problems and they've got external problems. And I could see why the reaction would have been so harsh against the Cathars, because if you have that sort of internal threat going on while you're trying to fight external threats, because Islam is trying to push its way into Western Europe, you
Exactly.
can't have that happen, because the house divided against itself isn't going to stand, as Christ our Lord said. So the sort of the beginning, more or less the tipping point that sort of really makes Catharism well known to France is what we call the siege of Béziers, or the massacre at Béziers. And I'll kind of give a brief overview of that. So what had happened is the Pope sent an Abbot Amaury, to with an army of crusaders to the city of Béziers in France, where they had heard a lot of the Cathars had resided, and they parked themselves outside of the city walls, and they said they wanted to speak with the governors and the mayors of the city. And of course they shut themselves in, like, what's going on, right? And getting ready for an attack. And the abbot basically says, we're here for the Cathar heretics, throw them out and there won't be a war. We'll cart them off back to Rome, they'll be tried for heresy by the Inquisition, y'all get to live. And the governors of the city said, we can't turn the Cathars out to you because if we do, we'll be turning out our own friends and family,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so, which I understand. It's like, that's who's going to give up their child or their mother or their father or whatever, right?
Right.
And they pled with them, hey, turn them out. And they said, no, we're not going to do it. And he said, okay, well, tomorrow we're starting a siege, so you better prepare, right? And
Right.
of course, they didn't stand a chance against the Pope's mounted knights, not to mention all the mercenaries they hired for the fight. And it's funny because one of the commanders of the Crusaders came to the abbot and said, Abbot, how will we tell Catholic from Cathar once the fight starts?
Right.
And he says something that many people quote, especially in action movies and westerns, that they have no idea where it comes from. Well, this is where it comes from. He replied to the Crusader commander, kill them all and God will decide. So kill them all, let God sort them out. That actually came from the abbot. He was like, in other words, this is a siege. Don't ask, are you Catholic or Catholic? Just kill. Right. And so, but what happens is rather than the traditional rules of war siege going on, some mercenaries in the middle of the night attack the walls of the city. And this starts a chain reaction to where the siege starts early. And then all of a sudden, it all hell breaks loose in Beziers. Um, as I mentioned, they didn't stand a chance against the Pope's armies. They were the finest armies in Western Europe. They break down the gates, they go inside, and many of the Cathars hide inside the local cathedral. There was actually two cathedrals there, and the first ones in the cathedral, they broke down the doors. It took them a long time to break down the doors with a ram because cathedrals were actually built a lot like castles.
Mm-hmm.
And they went inside and they slaughtered everybody inside. Whereas the other cathedral, if I'm recalling to memory correctly, they didn't even bother breaking into that one because it would take too long. They just burned it down with the people inside, men, women, and children. And what they did is anybody who was captured in the siege, which would have been any defenders and plus their families, women and children, they stripped them naked, and then they made a big giant pyre, and I tend to think they may have just used the church that they'd set on fire. And at the tips of swords and spears, they just pushed them into the flames and burned them alive. And the idea that people always wonder why are witches and heretics burned is the idea is they wanted to not have a single memory of you left. They wanted nobody to be able to mourn your grave or your passing. They wanted no sort of relics left over, that because the idea was if they made you into a martyr or a saint by your people, then people would fight harder.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of most effectively erasing their memory was to burn them along with any works they had written down, which the Cathars didn't write much of anything down. And that's sort of
But
the
this is why, when I was saying earlier that we don't have a lot of information about them,
this might be, yeah.
this is why, because they didn't write much down, and what they did write down got burned, which unfortunately is also why there's a bunch of conspiracy theories. Like this whole philosophy of like we should just burn them all and erase all the memory of them. It totally backfired because now you have like Trail of Blood, you have all of
Yeah.
these, books that have come out where they tell this alternative history where it's like, oh, actually the Cathars were the good guys and they were just misunderstood and all this. And since we don't have really much of anything from the Cathars, it's really sometimes difficult to refute these people who want to tell this alternate history because they can be saying that the Cathars were actually aliens. And there's not much I can do about it because, like, okay, but they didn't leave me any real writings that I can look back and say, yeah, you're full of crap, dude. So
Right.
this
And
is why you should not. I know that I get that it's tempting, and and Catholics weren't the only ones who did this. Japan did the same thing to both Catholic and Orthodox missionaries in Japan. They would
yeah,
burn, especially Japanese people who converted to Christianity. They would
Hindu
burn them, and
Christians too. And
yeah,
it's like, I mean, St. Thomas was murdered by Hindus.
yeah,
Yeah, so I mean,
right,
the idea that it's that religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Confucianism are just peaceful and all that. Not really.
No.
Not always. Not always. But it's yeah, because I always want to say you do know a lot of Buddhists were samurai, right?
Right, exactly.
So it's like you might want to rethink that there.
Exactly.
But yeah, this is just it's and the other problem is without written documents from the Cathars. Well, it's like like with Trail of Blood that tries to argue like the Cathars or Baptists or whatever, right? Um, it's like I think I'm exaggerating there, but when you make that sort of case,
You're
I'm like, okay,
not. You're not.
show
That's
me show
literally
me
what
the evidence,
Trail of Blood argues.
right? I'm like, well, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence of
Right.
the Catholics believe this, and there is none. And so you basically have to make it up, or you have to rely on the Catholic sources that actually tell about what the Cathars did, right? And
Right.
the problem is now if you're trying to pull this whole Trail of Blood thing is you have to rely on the accounts of your enemies who you say can't be trusted. So it
Right.
becomes this vicious circle of trying to prove something by using the evidence you say you can't use.
Hmm.
Um, the other problem I want to say though is like people, this is one of the misconceptions people have about the Middle Ages is that they think that, oh, they found out you were a witch, they burned you. They found out that you were engaging in some sort of heresy, they burned you. That's actually not true. In fact, more people were burned as witches and heretics in the early modern period, starting
Hmm.
with the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance, um, than they were in the Middle Ages. I mean, for example, if you were caught, like, say, practicing witchcraft. Now, depending on what the type of witchcraft you were practicing, if you were practicing like, actual diabolism, devil worship, you were probably going to die. But as
Yeah.
far as like, oh, you were
Maybe
reading a
raised.
horoscope, you
Right.
were doing some tarot cards or reading a palm or something like that, they probably would have given you a slap on the wrist. I mean, literally, they would have said, they would have taken your cards or whatever, and they would have said, if depending on how severe it was, you might have gotten a public whipping, you might have gotten a penance of some kind, but they weren't going to kill you over that. I mean, the peasantry in France, for example, had like engaged in astrology pretty regularly, and it was
Yeah.
never pressed by the church. It was considered sinful to do, but you were never like going to be executed over something as
Right.
menial as tarot cards or fortune telling. I mean, even Philip Melanchthon.
Yeah.
uh, Philip Melanchthon, who was Martin Luther's protege, right? He would was it the Synod of Dort he wouldn't go to because he said that like he well he was supposed to go. I think he was supposed to go to the Synod of Dort and like he wouldn't go because he had a bad horoscope reading that he went it was going to be really bad for him and so he didn't go. And even like John Calvin actually wrote that like in and of itself, astrology wasn't bad. It
Right.
was like the only reason he discouraged its practice is like because he said that you could get it wrong and then you'd have people telling false prophecies. But he's like the practice in and of itself was not condemnable. I've always found that funny. It's like for all the things he was against, it's like
I know.
I'm like astrology is just a okay. Which
Astrology's
there is an
cool.
Orthodox
Icons
astrology.
of Christ, no, but astrology, yes.
Yeah, that's fine. You know, what? But yeah, it's so there was this sense that folk magic practices weren't exactly condemnable, but this idea that everybody was just being burned right and left and hanged right and left or submitted to the Inquisition right and left it's nonsense. It didn't
Right.
happen, you know. But the Cathar Crusade again goes on for 20 years, and another really peak point that happens during the Cathar Crusade is the siege of Marmande, France. Um, and this is similar to the siege of Béziers, only the defenders of that, the count, whose name I cannot pronounce, was very well armed and ready
Hmm.
for a siege. And this siege goes on almost a year in France, in Marmande, France. And so Count de Montfort, who is the one who was issued the charge to actually fight, hold this siege against Marmande, kind of gets into a stalemate and can't really move forward, can't really, back away either. So the idea was that you would just wait out your enemy until their supplies were completely gone. They'd be starving to death, disease would be taking over, and then they would just surrender the city. And what that might have happened, but the thing was is that Prince Louis of France showed up with a very large force to reinforce the siege. And Louis had been trying to actually conquer England so he could be king of England and France. That failed. So he gets commissioned by his dad to go help Count de Montfort with the siege of Montmartre against the Cathars. And well, that actually does make things worse, as you can tell. They start just hammering the city. They don't get in. That's the amazing thing. They don't get into the city. They just keep the attack up because they got this fresh supply of soldiers. They just keep attacking until eventually the Cathar defenders are just exhausted. Like they can't fight anymore. They don't have the manpower. So the count comes out of the city along with some of his chief noble supporters. They sit down and talk turkey with Count de Montfort and Prince Louis and a papal legate. Okay, a papal legate's there too, along with a college of bishops from Rome. Okay, and essentially, more or less, what happens is they have this conversation with the count, the Cathar count. Again, I can't pronounce his name, and but the papal legate's not present, and so they agree to let the count surrender. And the count says, I will surrender the city so long as you guarantee that everybody is going to be spared.
Which,
We'll
by the
submit.
way, this follows the rules of war to a T. So, like
Right.
at up to this point, there's not really an atrocity being committed. This is all stuff that, when the Count decided that he was rebelling against France, he was signing up for this sort of thing. When
Hmm.
the French came to attack, they knew this was so it's like this is all the way war was carried out back then. Nobody has really done anything too egregious yet. We're getting there, but they're
Right.
following the rules of war is my point. So, you
Yeah.
know,
This is before the code of this is code of chivalry essentially,
yeah.
and this is before a Geneva Convention or anything like that too. And this is sort of the building blocks of the Geneva Convention, because you have to ask yourself, when Christian nation fights Christian nation, which from an Orthodox perspective should never happen. It really should never happen.
Right.
Christian should not kill Christian, but Western Europe was perfectly happy to do that. I mean, the Hundred Years' War,
Right.
France, uh, but anyway, they had these codes of chivalry involved, which said you could do this, but you can't do that, right? Which that's sort of biblically based when you think about it. This is
Mhm.
how Yahweh does with Israel and the Torah. It's like you can't cut down the fruit trees. You can't
Mhm.
slaughter people needlessly when they've surrendered to you and things like that.
Exactly.
So they make the deal with him, and he says, I will, submit the city to you. We'll open the gates. We'll do what you ask, right? And so they agree to those terms. The count and the prince agree to the term with the Cathar count, and he goes back inside and tells the city, prepare for surrender, right? Well, the papal legate finds out this deal has been made, and little does Prince Louis and Count de Montfort know, but the papal legate had orders from Rome to slaughter everyone inside the city. And they get into this fight about what should happen, right? It's like, no, I've already made these terms. This is the rules of war. You're asking me to break the rules of war, and you're asking me to put my reputation on the line. And of course, the papal legate is probably like, don't worry about it. I'll give you an indulgence or a penance or whatever. And of course, to
And they're
his
like,
credit,
that's not the point.
right. And to the credit of Count de Montfort and Count and Prince Louis, they were very reluctant to do it. And from what we can tell, from what little historic information we have, they were holding their ground against the papal legate. But what had happened is, much like Beziers, is some of the knights had kind of overheard what was going on between the papal legate and the prince and the count, and they just charged the city. The gates were already open for surrender. So the knights go into the city, and like 5,000 people are just slaughtered, men, women, and children indiscriminately. And once it started, there was no stopping it. You put a sword in a man's hand, and it's, and you got to understand that knights were paid a little, and a little bit of, and volunteer soldiers were paid very little, and mercenaries weren't paid at all. So how are they going to get their money's worth? Well, they're going to sack the city and take what they want, right?
Mhm.
So that's what happens, is the siege ends with just the unexpected slaughter of the citizens of Mamarnde. The only people that are spared is, I'm going to try to say his name, Count de Tesserac, the Cathar count, and a handful of his knights are spared. That's it, and they're ransomed back to into prison to make sure that nobody else rebels. But literally, almost everybody else is slaughtered. It's wholesale, right? And so this is sort of the dark, eerie time period that we have in this book, and it's just ripe for dark things to happen. And it's not for me and Kevin, for sure. This is just looking at this from one, not being Western Christians anymore, but Eastern minded Christians.
Mhm.
Um, we have a very different perspective of what should happen. We won't give this away until you read the book. Yeah, no spoilers, guys. Um, but looking at this from our perspective, it's not only horrifying in the sense of what human beings, through what we would consider a heretical patriarch did to people they considered heretical, but it's also horrifying in the sense that what spirit was at work in France that made the Cathars do things like ritual suicide,
Mhm.
ritual abortion, and starving themselves to a point of, almost being completely emaciated. What spirit drove the Crusaders to justify killing children, babies, right? And things like that, and unarmed peasantry and women. Um, it's a dark time where dark spirits are at work, from our perspective, and this is where our story sort of takes place, is at the kind of the midpoint of the Cathar Crusade, because it's 1219 when the book occurs. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's interesting, I don't want to give any spoilers either, but since you mentioned the difference of the Orthodox perspective, you
Mm,
know, um, I do have to say that when Cheryl was reading our book, my wife Cheryl has been reading our book to kind of help us with editing, because she used to be the managing editor for a magazine a long time ago and stuff, so she's really good at that sort of thing, and she's helping us out. But also she is just interested in it because she's like, hey, this is cool. So she was reading our book and she got to the part that we're talking about where this is happening, and I won't give away what we do with it, but I will just say that after she read that, she actually came to me and she said, I want to say that I love how much Orthodoxy has really transformed you, because when you were a Western Christian, you could not have written this book. When you were a Western Christian, you definitely had you talked about you could have written books about the Crusades and stuff, but it would have been very I guess propagandistic, justifying things. Definitely the perspective is like, hey, if somebody's a heretic, if you kill them, they can't spread their heresy, so why is that bad? The
yeah.
perspective of like, I was never necessarily cool with burning people,
Mm-mm.
but I would have probably said, actually, funny enough, I probably would have been very similar to John Calvin, because actually
Yeah.
John Calvin said he didn't think heretics should be burned. He thought that was not a righteous thing. He said hanging people is a way more humane way of
Or
killing them.
beheading. Yeah.
Yeah, or
And
beheading. Like, just
Michael,
do
what's
that.
his name?
But
Yeah.
yeah, I forget his name, but exactly, he didn't want him to be burned. And then the
Vetus.
city of
Yeah.
yes, exactly, Servetus. And then the city of Geneva just burns him anyway. And Calvin didn't say that they had sinned or anything, but he he did, appeal to them that they should come up with a more humane solution, and I probably would have agreed with that. But but Cheryl was like, the thing is that now the way you talk about this is so different, and the way you approach this is so different, and so not modern in any way. I don't think like, oh, it's cool, just let heretics be heretics. It doesn't matter. That's not the point.
Right.
The point is that um the church is not called to be people's executioner. The church is called to be their hospital,
Right.
and we should not be people with bloodlust who desire the destruction of the wicked, because even God doesn't desire the destruction of the wicked. And if anyone had a right to hate people, if anyone had a right to desire someone's destruction, it's God. And even he says, I take no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked, but that a soul
Yeah.
should turn from his wickedness and live. And so the patristic, the fatherly way of addressing heretics, the way that we should genuinely care about people who are in heresy or in witchcraft or in any of these things. We should desire their salvation, not their destruction. And it should grieve us anytime the soul of a human being goes to hell. And the fact that Caleb and I have been able to go from being in this Western mindset to being in this Eastern mindset by the grace of God and transformed in this way, I guess I'm saying this as much to Caleb himself as to our audience, but just the fact that this transformation is visible in the book that we've written is my family is talking about this transformation. My wife is talking about how amazing this transformation that God has worked is. She's talking about how much she loves the book because of how it puts on display the difference between East and West. That it's like, you know, when I was a Presbyterian, I was part of a church that was super into the whole DAP post mill thing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good in that, don't get me wrong. There's good things that they have, but the dark side of post mill stuff is, they
Theonomy.
exactly theonomy, and they justify a lot of bad things. And they especially, I don't know why, but they cannot just for the life of them admit that the Puritans were terrible people. It's like
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
think it's like they think that if they admit this, it's somehow a denial of post mill or something. And I'm like, just say that they were bad already. Like, it's
And
clear
I
that
think,
they were horrible people.
and my thing is that I think the reason why they can't is because one, they wisely recognize that America was never a Christian
Right.
nation. I mean, if you understand the that the grand majority of the founding fathers were deists and Freemasons
Mm-hmm.
who at best believed in the Aristotelian conception of God, which literally amounts to nothing. Um, they, the only Christian roots they can find in America is Puritanism. That's
Right.
it. It's not Catholicism, at least for not for the most part. And and so what are you left with? So you kind of have to uphold this image of Puritans as being good and righteous people. But I'm like, if you read some of their own writings about what they said about Native Americans, what
Yeah.
they did to Native Americans, and what they did to Quakers and Anabaptists, and I'm like, tell me how much that's different from what we see in the Taliban or ISIS. It's
Right.
really at the end of the day, and I don't
No,
think
in
anybody
fact,
is themselves.
I've been contemplating
Yeah,
writing or doing a presentation about the disturbing similarities between the Puritans and Islam,
yeah.
because it's bizarre how similar they are. I
And
mean,
they waged a civil war against England. That's
yeah,
what that's what the
exactly.
English Civil War was about. It was about traditional Anglicanism against, the Puritan strain that was led by Oliver Cromwell. And
Mm-hmm.
violent.
And
It was
Oliver
horrible.
Cromwell was a genocidal maniac. I mean, he was just terrible.
He hated Irish people with a
Yeah,
passion.
for
Yeah, and so
literally no reason. It's just like,
because he's
uh,
British, not
right,
speaking as an
exactly.
Irishman. But
Exactly.
yeah, and I'm not even saying that the Orthodox Church, at least members of the Orthodox Church, are squeaky clean. I mean, we've had our own share of
Hmm.
persecuting heretics, but usually when the church has persecuted heretics, it's usually not the priests or a version. We didn't even have a version of the Inquisition. It's
Right.
usually the state justifying the atrocities by using the teachings of the church
Hmm.
to do so. Like, for example, I can't remember what they were called, but they were called the milk drinkers
Hmm.
in England, in Russia, were heavily persecuted by the Russian government under the believe it was the czars, but not on the mass you see in Western
Right.
Europe. And I think the reason why this occurs is, like you said, we see ourselves as primarily a hospital for the sick, and we've seen this really sharp distinction between church and state. That's the reason we have the two-headed eagle.
Right.
Right there, it's a we the church and the state are supposed to help each other. That's not even a question, but they are clearly not the same thing. With medieval sacralism, they pretty much are the same thing. I mean, you had the pope excommunicating kings, right? You had
Right.
the pope, who could literally tell a king what to do, as far as like, do I go to war or do I not,
Right.
uh, and that didn't occur in the Eastern Hemisphere because
Exactly.
we don't have one single power head that's top tier down that could, do things like that. We certainly had bishops who could excommunicate a king, but like as far as like telling him, don't go to war, do go to war, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. The other thing was the sharp distinction between what a clergyman was allowed to do. Um,
Right.
so, for example, just comparing monastic practices in the West, the Benedictines, Dominicans, etc., could eat chickens and fish without a problem, but they couldn't eat four-legged animals and as well as dairy. Whereas in the East, our monks are strict vegans, right? Except on I think like on Pascha, they're allowed to eat fish
Hmm.
small shellfish like shrimp. But the other thing is that the clergy, just your everyday priests, could not bear the sword. They could not. And whereas in the West, you had literal monks who picked up the sword and became the Knights Templar, right?
Right.
So it's like, how are you a man of God who's supposed to be a shepherd, right? And then you're out killing people, right? It's like,
Exactly.
and this also gets into a lot of theological problems because how are you, for example, if you're like a hero monk Templar, how are
Hmm.
you serving the Eucharist and then going out and getting blood on your hands? And that would
Hmm.
like, I mean, our priests cannot even be butchers, you
Yeah.
know, they
Can't
cannot
mix
even
blood with blood.
right. You can't mix blood. You can't even be a surgeon, right? There's only one exception I've ever seen to that. Whose name escapes me. I think it was the one who was the surgeon and a priest. I can't remember his name, but there's very rare cases where that ever happens. And so the idea of
Right.
a warrior monk I mean, anything to do with the shedding of blood like that was just unthinkable. And
Exactly.
so, having this sort of thing happen where, oh yeah, the church needs to declare war on the Cathars, it's just foreign to an Eastern mind,
Exactly.
right?
And
And I'm not,
even like, the examples, there are a few examples in history
yeah,
where like czars would persecute some religious minority or whatever. But what you almost, in fact, pretty much 100% of the time, what you see is that that only happens if that group turns violent. So,
yeah,
like,
or
so
story on like young women or men or things. We
exactly.
had a lot of like groups that were preying on young men for homosexual gratification.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So when bizarre stuff like that starts to happen, or if they get violent, so like the old believers were persecuted, but the old believers didn't get persecuted until they started doing like going against the established church. Baptists were never really persecuted in Russia except some Baptist groups did get arrested and things, but it's because they were burning cathedrals and stuff. So if they started doing
Idolatry.
things, that's right. So if
Yeah.
they started doing things, then yeah, the state responded to protect its citizens. And there were times where the state responded in a very heavy handed way that went way too far. And when
Hmm.
that happened, that's not a good thing. It's the same thing you see happen in Egypt, where it's like the Jews burned a church in Alexandria, so then a mob of Christians burned like 40 synagogues and stuff, and Cyril of Alexandria is like, okay guys, you need to calm down, like this isn't good, you shouldn't
Which
be
isn't Christian
burning.
behavior. Yeah.
Right, this isn't Christian behavior. Stop, don't burn people's synagogues. But the point is that like it happened and the state was kind of allowing this behavior because the state felt like it had a responsibility to protect the Christians who were being attacked by the Jews initially. And then the church only stepped in to say we shouldn't be doing this because from the church's perspective, this had gotten out of hand. People were now actually like actively attacking Jews, and that's not right either. You shouldn't. So the church would often step in and try to prevent people from being persecuted for for their beliefs or whatever because we're a hospital for sinners. But there
Right.
were times where the state would step in and stop people from doing evil, and that's not necessarily wrong. But yes, they would go too far, as the state is wont to do
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
every country, in every place.
Absolutely. And that's the whole hospital for the sick thing really, brings to mind the nature of the church as being, I always tell people this, if you burn down a pagan's temple, they're just going to rebuild it and they're going to resent you for it, right?
Hmm.
But if you convince the pagan that his gods are evil and that paganism is wrong, they will become Christians and burn down their own pagan shrines.
Exactly.
That to me is far more effective and far more godly than having the state come in and force that to happen, right? So perfect example is I'm thinking about is my Irish ancestors. When people think that Patrick actually like evangelized all of Ireland, that's actually sort of not true. He did evangelize a lot of Irish and made a lot of converts,
Hmm.
but he did not suppress the pagan practices of other people. The main thing he suppressed was the worship of Crom, which
Hmm.
was this violent, bloody, blood sacrifice, human sacrifice stuff involved with this worship. And that was the main thing that he suppressed. But he did it with the help of the Celtic tribes who had had
Hmm.
enough of this bloody stuff, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and they burned down their own groves. He didn't tell them to do it. They did it themselves, and that
Exactly.
was far more effective in evangelizing Ireland than, enslaving the pagans and then uprooting them, which unfortunately that happened a lot in Western Europe, and it happened in the Americas when the conquistadors, with the Reconquista, brought it here.
Yeah.
Um, with the suppression of tribes, like the Aztecs and the Mayans, which don't get me wrong, the Aztecs and the Mayans,
We're not
their
good people.
bloody practices needed to be stopped with a sword. But
Yes.
as far as enslaving them and saying, all right, now you have to accept Catholicism, no, you know,
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
Christianity is never meant to be spread by the sword. So definitely they
there's
and
one religion
then
already does that. So
exactly. And then like we were just talking about, and I don't mean to keep bashing on the Puritans, but why not?
back when
They deserve it. Um but it's like the Puritans were 100% this way. It's just like they would just massacre people and enslave people and do whatever it took to, and then they would kind of like occasionally they would convert Native Americans to
very few, yeah,
Christianity, and then you know but even then it's like they would treat them as like second tier Christian. They didn't really treat them as like full members of the body of Christ.
Hmm.
Whereas in Alaska, Orthodoxy, the native people, they heard the gospel and they said, "Oh, we've actually been Christians all along, and we just needed someone to show us the way." And they fell in love with Jesus and made Jesus their own. And when Catholics converted, Native American tribes, those tribes are still Catholic to this very day because they weren't treated as second tier Christians. They weren't. Now, I'm not talking about up in Canada. I know there was atrocities committed up
Yeah.
in Canada, but in the United States, where the Puritans especially were involved, so many atrocities were committed against the natives, and some of it is just frankly like it's bizarre to think that like the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, love your
Hmm.
enemies and pray for those who persecute you, and then these people claim to be following him while they're murdering women and children. It makes no sense at all.
Yeah.
But this is what happens when you start down this road of justifications where it's you know, like we were talking about, they start down the road of justification saying, if we kill these people, they can't spread their heresy. We need to wipe out their memory so that this can't spread or be revived. We need to, and then you create these justifications, and over time it becomes more and more violent. Even like John Calvin, he, I think to some degree, to his credit, he wanted things to be humane, but he was still justifying the practices. And then his followers later, the Puritans, took it to a whole other place and said, we need to wipe people out, we need to destroy people, and all this. Well, who knows what would have happened if instead of that, John Calvin had converted to Orthodoxy and spread a message of forgiveness, a message of healing, a message of salvation as a hospital, not a courtroom. If he had spread that message, who knows if maybe the English Civil War never happened? Who knows if maybe the whatever the Puritans would have been noble and upright people who treated the Native Americans with respect. Who knows
Hmm.
if that would have happened? I certainly don't know and will never know because it didn't happen that way. But the point is that I do think that even if John Calvin probably would have been horrified by the behavior of the Puritans, because I know everybody hates John Calvin, but let's be honest, he was not a Puritan. So he
No.
probably would have been
No.
horrified by them. But he's still responsible for their behavior because his justifications led to their justifications for what they were doing. And then their whole bizarre belief about being the new Israel and the
Lead
Native
to
Americans
manifest
being
destiny and
right.
a secular Puritanism that dominates the American culture as the agreed upon American religion, whose only icon is the American flag.
That's right.
And
Exactly.
these are the founding fathers in the U.S. military.
That's
I'm
right.
just saying.
Exactly. The military industrial
I won't
complex.
get into that on this podcast, but I could. I really could. You know, we could.
Yeah, we could have a whole other maybe we should even have a whole
Maybe
other
we will one
podcast
day.
on
Yeah. Yeah.
that. That'd be a great
Yeah.
way for us to get like some CIA hit squads coming after
Oh,
us,
yeah.
though.
We'll convert them to, like Father John White said. He said they had the FBI guys trying to spy out their church.
Yeah,
And then they ended up converting for
they
real.
ended up converting.
I was like, come on, come on. You know, we'll
So
convert them
based.
too. Yeah. So I guess I know you got to run here in a minute, but I thought maybe we could end with kind of what we're going to do next.
Yeah,
So Keith
let's do
and I
it.
are hoping to keep making promotional videos. Yes, this is a shameless promotion. We did
That's
the
right.
hard work, and we're going to continue to do the hard work and not expect anybody else to do it. Right.
That's right.
So next couple of podcasts, thinking we can talk about what is demonosis. Um,
Yes.
we can also a big theme in our book. We could also, as opposed to theosis,
Mm-hmm.
we could also talk about monsters like vampires, werewolves,
Yes.
angels, demons, all that kind of stuff. Who is this crazy character known as Azazel, who gets a lot of
Hmm.
books? Um, all those kind of things.
And
I think
why is he in the Bible?
yes. Why is it in the Bible? It's a name that either gets translated away or it's a name that gets glossed over and says isn't important. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, it is very important. It's not only important in the Old Testament, it's important in the New Testament too, because
Exactly.
in some modern traditions, some modern Christmas traditions are related to Azazel. So we'll shut up for now because I don't want to spoil it for
Spoiler alert.
yeah. Yes. So hopefully this whets your appetite as far as what we have coming in this book. And then hopefully you will line up to buy it when we're done.
Yes,
So
exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
no, I think that's a perfect conclusion. Christ is king, the church is a hospital, and
don't be
um
Cathar.
yeah,
Avoid
don't
Gnosticism.
don't be Gnostic. Jesus defeated the false gods, so don't be Gnostic.
That's another one we could do is one on what are false gods.
Yes,
As
absolutely.
covered that enough, but maybe we need to refresh people.
Well,
So
Lord of Spirits has covered it. But just like in academia, where theses still have to be written, podcasts still have to be made. So,
yes, yeah,
Oh. Well, thank you so much for joining, Caleb, and thank you guys for
always.
watching. Please share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.